Hi, Tom. Thank you for joining me today on the Net Zero Compare podcast.
Carol, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invitation.
My pleasure. So, you have spent many years working at the intersection of technology, sustainability, energy, supply chains, and digital transformation. Your experience includes serving as a global VP at SAP, advising companies, speaking internationally, and building your own media platform focused on the energy transition, climate innovation, and supply chain resilience. So, let's start with your broader perspective. As I mentioned, you have been working at the intersection of technology, sustainability, and energy and supply chains. So when you look at the market today, what feels genuinely different compared with, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there has been a lot of change. I mean, if we go back even further, let's say we go back to about 2006, 2005, 2006. I don't remember the exact year, but that was the year, or that was around the time when the Al Gore movie, The Incontrovertible Truth, or Inconvenient Truth, sorry, The Inconvenient Truth was released. And that was a big wake-up call for a lot of people. And after that, you had a big kind of upswing in interest in climate and sustainability, which then kind of dissipated again in the years after the crash in 2008. It became less of an issue, started to pick up again in kind of the early 2010s to 2015, 2016. We had the Paris Agreement in 2015. And then you would start gathering momentum after Paris until, I would say, the last year or two. And I put that down pretty much directly to Trump's war on ESG. And one of the ways that that has manifested itself for me is at these, I have two podcasts, one on climate called Climate Confident and the other on supply chain, currently called Resilient Supply Chain. I had to change the name of it. At the end of last year, November 2025, I changed the name of it because it was branded Sustainable Supply Chain and it was all about sustainability and supply chain. But I was getting feedback from the people I was talking to that companies were starting to change the way that they were thinking and messaging their work around sustainability. Not so much what they were doing, but what they were saying they were doing. And that was a big wake-up call for me. I had, I read all the news, I see what's happening, but there was starting to be this kind of a chilling effect, and companies were backing away from what they were saying about sustainability, and they were now talking about it in terms of resilience rather than sustainability. So I rebranded the podcast Resilient Supply Chain. But to your question, those have been some of the changes. In the corporate space, in the energy space, there have been massive changes as well during the same time period, because back around the mid-2000s, we started to see solar and wind starting to pick up in their rollout. A large part of it due to the rollout of, what's the word I'm looking for?
Maybe also some government incentives. I remember that was the case in Europe.
That's it. That's what I was thinking of. I'm trying to... net metering, that's the word I was looking for. Due to the net metering that was given by the German government specifically, if I remember correctly, the German government was giving about 45 cents per kilowatt hour for energy generated from solar panels at the time. And that gave a huge boost to solar, which meant that you had a ramp up in the production of solar, particularly for Germany. But of course, with that ramp up, you had economies of scale and you had the learning curve, and you started to see the cost of solar falling roughly 20% for every doubling of installed capacity. And that made a beautiful virtuous circle, because as the price fell, more was rolled out. As more was rolled out, you had more learning curve, you had another 20% drop, you had it become more attractive to more people, therefore you had more rolled out, therefore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we've seen the solar price drop 99% in the meantime and continue to fall. And you've similar with wind, not to the same extent, but not far off it either. The wind prices have fallen 60, 70, 80%, depending on when you pick your starting time. And alongside that, you've also had the same happen with the battery storage space, both with lithium-ion batteries and more recently with vanadium flow batteries. And so the storage technologies alongside the renewables means that now the combination of renewables plus storage is price competitive in most regions. In fact, is cheaper in most regions now than fossil fuels. And so when you take into consideration that you can build a solar park or a wind farm, combine it with storage for less than the cost of building a gas plant, and definitely less than a coal plant, but also faster to roll out, because the average time to roll out a gas plant is, from drawing board to electrons being produced, 5 to 7 years typically, because you have to do all these impact assessments and things like that and get permissions and yada, yada, yada. A solar park is about 2 years. So you can roll it out that much faster. It's also cheaper to roll out. And so despite the best efforts of Trump and his party, we're seeing, a massive uptick in the amount of clean energy being deployed. In fact, I saw a report just earlier this week, or maybe it was last week, talking about how solar has now overtaken coal for electricity production in the US. Globally, it's overtaken gas, but just in the US alone, just in the last week, it has overtaken coal for electricity production. So massive, massive changes. And no matter what Trump tries to do, he can't beat the economics. The renewables keep getting cheaper, and therefore they will win. They'll win by fact of economics, which is fantastic because that's even more sustainable when it's financially sustainable.
Exactly. And as we know, money talks. The price is probably one of the most important factors for customers. Thank you very much for that answer. I think it was a very good starting point because many companies hear the same words repeatedly, such as digital transformation, decarbonization, AI, resilience, and sustainability. But the real question I always say is whether the business environment has actually changed or whether we are just using new language for old problems. And I will just digress to what you've said earlier regarding this transition in Germany. Back in early 2000s, I still lived in Poland. I was a teenager, so I remember traveling because right now the difference is not that huge. But back in early 2000s, when we were traveling from Poland to Germany, you could see those solar panels all around the roofs everywhere. So that was a striking difference back then.
Yeah, and there's big changes happening now in the Polish energy grid as well, because Poland
That's
was
correct.
massively, massively coal heavy, and now it's rolling out a lot of renewables. And so it's fantastic to see Poland cleaning up its grid as well.
Yeah, we've been also talking about nuclear power for many years.
Yeah, nuclear has a couple of problems.
Nuclear
And
waste.
no, not so much. That isn't that kind of problem is it is a bit of a problem, but it's overstated often in the argument. The biggest problem that nuclear has, or biggest problems that nuclear has have biggest problems that nuclear have are the cost of deployment and the time to deployment. I mean, if you look, for example, at Hinkley C, which is the nuclear plant that's being built by EDF in the UK right now, that project started around 2007 to 2009 is when they started kicking off that project. They're hoping that it'll come online by 2035. And
Yeah, the timelines
that,
are
that
pretty long.
that's what they're hoping. And it's at a cost of deployment now, which is about 3 times the original estimated cost. It's close to 40 billion euros now in terms of cost. And it's going to produce 3 gigawatts of power. Now, the Dogger Bank wind park of the northeast coast of the UK is 3.6 gigawatts. Built in a fraction of the time it is producing electrons, built in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost. So right there, nuclear, if you started to build a nuclear power plant today because you wanted to produce green energy, you'd be wasting money and you'd be wasting time. The soonest you'd get it online, if you were lucky, would be 2050. So we need as much clean electrons as we can get. And if nuclear is contributing, great. But don't start a nuclear project now because it'll take forever and it'll cost a fortune. You could be producing far more power far more quickly from renewables backed by storage.
To be honest, I need to admit that many of our guests share your perspective because they always put solar energy above nuclear and other. So yes, solar energy probably is on the top of the food chain currently.
Yeah. I mean, it's just down to basic economics, as you said earlier, and timelines. We need to get as much clean energy on the system as quickly as possible. And nuclear is not going to deliver on that.
Agreed. And from your perspective, are companies now treating sustainability more as a compliance obligation, a risk management issue, or a source of business value? This is the question especially relevant for our audience because many companies are no longer looking at sustainability only as a branding or corporate responsibility topic. When we talk to them, they are dealing with reporting requirements, customer expectations, investor pressure, procurement rules, and operational risks.
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is it depends. It depends on which companies. Having said that, there's a lot of new legislation online and coming online around reporting. And there's a lot of, you've got CBAM in Europe, you've got the CSDDD, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for a lot of companies, the drive to be sustainable is sure driven by compliance, but also there are a lot of other stakeholders to take into consideration. So, for example, if you think about a company's customers, your customers want you to be sustainable. There are very few customers out there looking for evil corp. They want to be spending their money increasingly with companies that have a good sustainability story to tell. So if you are sustainable, if you have a good sustainability story to tell, and you can back it up with data, then your cost of recruitment of customers and your cost of retention of customers comes way down. It's far easier to get customers and to keep them if you have a good sustainability story to tell. That's stakeholder number one. Stakeholder number two, employees. Same story. I had Ken Pucker on my podcast last year, I think it was. He is now a lecturer in a university in the US, but earlier in his career, he was the COO of Timberland back when they started reporting their emissions first in the early 2000s, very, very early to it. And there was almost no one else doing it at the time. And he said that when they were advertising jobs then, they would get people applying for the jobs who were way, way, way overqualified for the roles they were advertising. And it was because they were one of the few companies that had this good sustainability story to tell. And he said their similar story with retention. People didn't want to leave. So it's the same for any company today. If you want to attract good talent and keep good talent, again, that'll be far easier if you have a good sustainability story to tell. And companies know cost of recruitment and retention of employees and cost of recruitment and retention of customers is a significant cost. So if you can reduce those costs, your costs are coming down. It's straight from your bottom line, And then you've got things like your banks and your insurers. Banks, their loan books are now being looked at and they have to report on the emissions associated with their loan books. So these are called financed emissions. So now if you have a high emissions portfolio, your projects are high emissions, you're building a gas plant or whatever it is, or you're a manufacturer and you've got, a steel or aluminium or something coming in to your as part of your bill of materials, the banks are going to look at you and they're going to say, sorry, your cost of capital is going up because you are adding emissions to our loan book. We don't want to be an attractive lender to you. You're certainly not an attractive customer to us. And it's not just that you might have high emissions. you have to report your emissions to the bank, and they have to include Scope 3. And it cannot be, well, it can be averages, industry averages, but if you're reporting primary data as opposed to industry averages, they'll take your data far more seriously. If you're reporting industry averages, then you're a more risky candidate, and your charges, your cost of capital will increase. But if you are reporting primary data, then they know exactly what they're dealing with. You're less risky, so your cost of capital comes down. And it's the same with the insurance industry for exactly the same reasons. The insurance industry have to report on who they're insuring and the emissions associated with them. And so if, again, you have low emissions or you have good data around your emissions, then you're fine. You won't have any problem with your insurance. Your cost of insurance will be lower. On the other hand, the opposite is also the case. If you don't have good data or you are high emissions, then your cost of insurance goes up. And as well as that, if you are high emissions, your customers, your industry customers, are going to look at you and go, well, you're adding to my banking charges. You're adding to my insurance charges. You need to get your emissions down or we're going to have a conversation. So you become far less attractive. So customers, banks, insurance, employees, and then there's boards. Your investors and your boards are also putting pressure on you to get your emissions down and be more sustainable. So there's a lot of stakeholders involved and lots of reasons why companies should be more sustainable and get their emissions down. So yes, it does start off as a compliance exercise often, but increasingly it's becoming an exercise around risk adjustment and as well about, getting costs down in terms of insurance, banking, customers, employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And all those savings that you've just mentioned, do you think they will offset potential higher prices associated with sustainable products? Let's say we have product A and product B. It's not always the case, but in many cases, sustainable products cost more. And now you mentioned all those cost savings. Do you think they will be able to offset that product A, which is sustainable, and product B will cost the same amount of money, or maybe even product A will be cheaper?
That's a very much it depends answer. However, what I would say is there can be what they call a green premium on products, and some sustainable products can be more expensive. However, I think that's short term. I think it's short term because I think a lot of the ways that companies are becoming more sustainable, it's using newer technologies, and we've got that learning curve that hasn't quite kicked in yet, or those economies of scale that haven't quite kicked in yet. But as people are learning and they go along that journey, the costs will reduce, they will fall. And what you got to think is being more sustainable very often means being more efficient. It's getting waste out of your system. And the very fact that you're becoming more efficient means your costs should come down, not go up. So yes, there is now a green premium on sustainable products often. I won't say always, but I think that'll go away. And in fact, I think in time, green products, because the processes involved in their production is more efficient, plus the energy sources to produce them are lower cost, they will de facto be cheaper. And they will be the obvious choice.
That's a very promising assumption, but I hope it will be like this. And I need to admit that I do agree with this, because I think it will be very similar like with organic products. The difference in price was huge, let's say even 10 years ago. Nowadays, when you go to a store, even bananas, organic or not organic, maybe the difference is 20 cents per kilo. So most probably it will be the same with sustainable products and services in the future.
A lot of that is down to scale. Again, I got to think, because the organic products de facto have fewer inputs. So again, the price to produce them should be lower, or in worst case, at par. So it's a matter of scaling the production, and I think they will become, if not price parity, if not cheaper, price parity at least.
But as you said, there are different factors. It always depends because on one hand side, yes, you don't need to use fertilizers, preservatives, but at the end of the day, maybe more products, more food will get spoiled during transportation, or for example, crops will be decimated, and so on and so forth. So yes, we need to be always taking into consideration those different factors. But still, down the road, I also think that this green premium, as you called it, it should diminish.
Yep.
Now, I would like to talk about supply chain resilience, because supply chain resilience has become a much bigger topic after recent disruptions in the Middle East. So, if you could tell us, what does a resilient supply chain actually mean in practical business terms?
Yeah, well, I mean, just thinking through the words resilient supply chain, it's a supply chain that obviously uh, gets through disruptions with fewer difficulties, is probably the best way to put it. And referring to the issues in the Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz being closed recently, that was a massive global shock, completely unnecessary, but that's another story. And what it brought home to people was reliance on fossil fuels as an energy source is not a very secure supply chain for your energy. So we've had a couple of energy shocks in the last few years, particularly since 2020. We had COVID, then we had the war on Ukraine, which is ongoing, unfortunately. And then you had the US and Israel's attack on Iran, closing the Strait of Hormuz. And you've had massive fluctuations as a consequence in the price of gas, particularly as a result of the attack on Ukraine, and then subsequently oil and gas as a consequence of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. And this has shown industry and governments and people at the petrol pump that your energy prices are massively volatile if you're sourcing your energy from fossil fuels. Whereas if you are sourcing from renewables, you're producing them locally, sun and wind have no problems getting through the Strait of Hormuz. And in many cases, energy companies now have what are called PPAs, price purchase agreements. And so you can, depending on the energy company, you can say to your energy company, build a solar park for me with battery backup and give me the energy and give me a price for that energy for the next 20 years. And they'll do it. There are lots of companies now giving out what are called power purchase agreements, PPAs, and they build a solar park or they build a wind park, more often a solar park, but it can be either with battery backup, and they give you a guaranteed price, often cheaper than your local utility, and it's a guaranteed price for it's usually a minimum of 20 years. It's usually 20, 25 or 30 years. So you've got guaranteed pricing. And as I say, often cheaper than your local utility. And so that's a no-brainer. And a lot of these companies who provide these PPAs do so by leasing the equipment to you. So you don't have a big upfront capex. They own the equipment, they own the solar park, they own the storage, and then they just bill you monthly and you have a guaranteed price for that energy coming in. It's a no-brainer. It's energy security and it's security of price. So the companies that are providing these PPAs have seen a massive surge of interest because companies who want to be resilient, to your question, need to have a secure source of energy. And they need to have as well, they need to know how much they're going to be paying for their energy, because that massively affects their inputs and the cost of production. And so if they can source local energy, either through a PPA or putting solar panels on their roof or get a renewable contract from their local utility or whatever it is, that source of resilience is a huge, huge relief to a lot of organizations. And it's not something that I think a lot of companies were thinking too much about before. I would say 2022, particularly here in Europe, with the massive spike we saw in the gas prices after the invasion of Ukraine, that brought it home to people. And then, people thought, look, things have settled down. We'll be fine. And suddenly, boom, you have another war, which, as we saw, closed the Strait of Hormuz. And now solar panels are about 30 to 40% cheaper than they were in 2022. So, those kind of details matter. It's a lot about timing. So for companies now, renewable power is suddenly looking even more attractive than it was before. So funnily, Trump's invasion of Iran has given a huge, huge boost. Not just...
I was just about to say that yes, there is some
ironic.
positive take on.
It's so ironic because we've even seen across Europe, the sales of electric vehicles have jumped 40% in the last couple of months. And it's because people are going to the gas pump and they're seeing, 180, 190, €2 a litre, whatever it is. I don't know. I haven't gone to a gas pump since 2018. We're a fully electric household since 2018 for transportation and for heating and cooling and for cooking. But I think during the height of the closing of the straits, the price at the local petrol pumps was probably around 180, 190 per litre, whereas I'm buying my electricity. I have three prices depending on time of day, but at the cheap time of day, it's 8 cents per kilowatt hour. And I have solar panels on the roof as well, so I can charge my car. I can fill my car for €6.40. And that gets me 500 kilometers for €6.40. So when people are seeing those kind of numbers, and then they're going and they're seeing a litre of petrol or diesel is about 180, it's probably come down to about 150 now, but you need 5 of those litres or 6 of those litres to go 100 kilometers in even the most efficient cars. So it's a complete no-brainer. You're seeing the cost of EVs coming down. You're seeing second-hand EVs. The price of them is very low as well, and far more of them coming on stream as the market matures. And we're also seeing the data from EVs showing that the batteries of EVs after 250, 300,000 kilometers are still at 80 to 90% of their original capacity. Those batteries go on forever. They're warranted by the manufacturers typically for 7 to 8 years. But I don't know, Carol, have you ever driven a car 200,000 kilometers?
Never. Never for such a long stretch.
Yeah, I had a Prius which I drove 110,000 kilometers when I sold it. But I drive, let's say, 10 to 15,000 kilometers per year. So to get to 300,000 kilometers, that's a lot of driving. And the car would still be at 80 to 90% of original capacity. It currently goes about 500 kilometers on a full charge. So 80 to 90% of that's, still 400 kilometers or so on a full charge. That's fine. So as I say, the secondhand value of cars, of EVs, I think they're underpriced for what they are because they don't depreciate in quality the same way an internal combustion engine does over time. They're far more reliable. And you've got no oil changes, you've got no timing belts. Your maintenance costs on an EV are typically about 40 to 50% of what they are on an internal combustion engine car. My current car is an EV3, Kia EV3, lovely car. And I had it a little over a year when this warning light came on the dashboard saying it needed to be serviced. And I went, okay, it's a year old. Fine. So I rang the Kia dealership and I said, there's a light on my dashboard says the car needs to be serviced. He said, how old is it? I said, it's a year old. How much have you driven? 15,000 kilometers. He said, turn off the light. We don't service the EVs until they're either 2 years old or they've driven 30,000 kilometers. They're not due for maintenance. So, that wouldn't be the same with an internal combustion engine vehicle. So they go on forever. They need very little maintenance. They cost nothing to charge. So, why wouldn't you? And as I say, because this has shocked people, this war and the increase in price of petrol and diesel, a lot more people are saying to themselves now, oh, maybe I should look into this EV stuff. And they see their neighbors driving an EV and they go, they've got an EV. I wonder how that's going for them. And then they have a chat with the neighbor. I've taken my neighbors out in the EV and I've said, have a drive, you take over. And, when they drive it and when they see what it's like to drive, which is great fun because they're fast. And when they hear about the costs of running it, they're like, okay, let me take a trip down to the dealership. So
the shift is definitely there. I can even tell from my experience when I talk to EV owners, they are unaware of what's going on with global oil markets. What are the global prices? They are not impacted in any shape or form, including my sister.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's funny because I distinctly remember, I live in the south of Spain. I live in Seville on the south of Spain. You can probably tell from the complexion and the accent, I'm not originally Spanish. I'm originally from Ireland, but I've been here since 2008. And we in 2019, we went on holidays to Cadiz. Beautiful, beautiful city in the south of Spain on the Atlantic coast. Absolutely gorgeous. And we went there in our EV. I bought an EV the year before. It was our first EV. And my kids at the time were, I don't know, 10, 12 years old, that kind of thing. And no, they were a little older, but it doesn't matter. They were early teens. And I used to give them a daily job of taking the dogs for a walk. And I said to them, okay, here's a bet. You take the dogs for a walk, and if you see an EV and take a photograph of it and come back here, I'll give you €10.
Good one.
The whole summer, I didn't lose a single euro. We were the only car in Cadiz that was an EV. That was 2019. Fast forward to today, I would be broke. I would be absolutely broke. It used to be the case that when I went out...
Especially in Oslo, Norway, yes. Because you have only EVs,
even more
right?
so. No, because we went on holidays that summer. We went on holidays summer... maybe it was 2018. We went to Norway, and
so I was there around the same time, because it's been a long time ago, and I do remember what struck me right away, how silent the whole city center was. You couldn't hear anything. Not only talking about people shouting and screaming, there was not this hum and bustle of the city. You couldn't hear cars, and every single car was EV, a lot of Teslas. So to be honest, it was very rare to spot any other car than EV.
Yeah. And we hired a Tesla. We rented it for 2 weeks and drove up along the fjords, up along the Atlantic coast. And it was gorgeous and it was a fantastic experience. And we had no problem getting charges. The infrastructure had been laid out. And of course, the ferries were cheaper and the parking was cheaper for EVs. So it was brilliant. But what I was saying about here in Spain, it used to be the case that if I went out driving in the car and I saw another EV, it would be an exception. And now, when I go out in the car, it's exceptional if I don't see 3 or 4 EVs, and the number keeps going up. So it has completely flipped here. It's fantastic.
And going back to my initial question, thank you very much for this clarification and examples you gave. I think this is very important because resilience can sound vague. For one company, when we talk to them, it might mean better supplier visibility. For another, it might mean localizing production, reducing dependency on single suppliers, or improving the data quality across the value chain, and so on and so forth.
All very important. And
exactly.
All that stuff about the data visibility is hugely important as well. Going back to my earlier point about Scope 3 emissions and being able to report them to your banks and insurers, and also to your customers, because if your Scope 3 emissions, the emissions from your suppliers, are high, then you get into trouble when you try and talk to your banks and talk to your insurers. So that data visibility, and you need primary data from them to report to ensure that you can keep your bank and insurance costs down, and to ensure that you can say to your customers, look, here's actually the amount of emissions associated with our products.
Exactly. And where do you see the strongest link between supply chain resilience and sustainability? I'm curious how you see it, because that connection is often talked about, at least during our net zero compare discussions, but not always clearly explained. A company A may want a more sustainable supply chain, but it also needs a supply chain that works commercially, manages risk, and, let's say, can survive disruption.
Mm. Yeah. It's a good question, and it's a complex one to answer, because again, the answer is it depends. It depends on companies, it depends on markets, it depends on industries. Um, a lot of it goes back to what you talked about data visibility, because if you don't have visibility of the data from your suppliers, then you don't know how sustainable you are. Your customers don't know how sustainable you are. I would say that's the primary factor in, or it should be the primary factor for companies who want to go on a sustainability journey. It's also, going back to what we said earlier, it's around risk mitigation, because if you don't know what's in your supply chain, that's very risky right there. So it's it's risk management, it's compliance, it's sustainability, it's cost reduction. All of these things are about sustainability. So the data visibility is fundamental, absolutely fundamental. And of course, the only way you're going to get access to visible primary data is through digitization, and digitization of your customers. So all these things are tied together. You need them to be digital. You need to be digital. You need to be able to ingest their data through typically APIs, and you need to be able to measure and report on that and verify it. So yeah, it's a complex story, and the technology, frankly, in these kind of things is often the easy part. The the hard part is the people and the organization, the cultural shifts that are often required. Change management is always a challenge. People don't like change, and
Yes.
it's you know, swapping a computer in is zero problem typically, but changing the way people work and the processes involved and things like that, that can cause a lot of people to get their back up. So that has to be managed extremely carefully, because you want these projects to be successful.
And for innovation, you need the change at the end of the day. If I understood correctly, in a nutshell, access to information. This is the key: access to reliable information and data.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. For all kinds of reasons. But, to ensure that the data you're getting is, to your point, accurate and reliable, and you can depend on it, and then you can report on it.
Exactly. Although, what other guests also told me that deal with companies that help them navigate through different regulations, some companies are waiting until they will have this perfect data set, perfect data, but in many cases it will never happen. So they are
Yeah.
waiting. They don't go sustainable, but it's better to start with raw data as long as it's reliable, of course, not to wait until you'll have the perfect data sets, because this may never happen.
Yeah. No, very often a hybrid approach is what's called for. So you go for the 80-20 rule, where, you get your 20% of customers who are associated
Yes.
with your 80% of emissions, and you work on those initially. And then for the other 20% of emissions or 80% of customers, you do averages until you can get them all to give you primary data. So, it's not going to be one day all averages and the next day all primary data. No, you have to work on it bit by bit by bit by bit. And as I say, go for the 80-20 rule and these kind of things always, because otherwise your head will explode.
Yeah, definitely. You also mentioned briefly scope 3. As we know, many companies still struggle with scope 3 emissions because most of the relevant data sits outside their direct control. If you could tell us what are the most common mistakes companies make when trying to measure or manage supply chain emissions?
Yeah, it's what we said earlier. The challenging piece of this is trying to get that data from your suppliers. It's not your data, it's their data. And so you have to find a way to get them to share that data with you. If not, you're using industry averages, which, as we said earlier, it's not great. It's better than nothing. But very often, if you're using a lot of industry averages rather than primary data, it's going to impact your cost of capital and your cost of insurance. And it's risky and reputationally risky because who knows what's hidden in that data that you're not getting. So you need to try and move all your suppliers to giving you data and giving you primary data. And not all will be able to do it because not all will be instrumented to do it. So their scope 1 and 2 is your scope 3. Are they measuring their scope 1 and 2? Yes, no. If yes, great. If no, that's a problem for them and it's a problem for you. And if it's a problem for you, you got to have a conversation with them and maybe you got to start looking for alternate suppliers, which becomes a problem for them. So it's very challenging. Different companies approach it in different ways, depending on budgets, depending on industry, depending on pressure, depending on markets, depending on all these kind of things. I know of at least one company who are in the leisure space, for example, a big hotel complex in
Can
Las
we
Vegas.
disclose the name?
No, they're based out of Las Vegas, though, I'll tell you that. And
Okay, it narrows down it a little bit.
what they did was they hired in a big consultancy and they paid for the consultancy to go to all their suppliers and work with the suppliers to get them on board. So if you are a hotel in Las Vegas, I guess, or a complex in Las Vegas, it wasn't just a hotel. If you're a complex in Las Vegas, maybe you have the money to do that, and that's great. And of course, then for the suppliers, it means, guaranteed customer. And it also means they start to know what their actual scope 1 and scope 2 are so they can report that and attract other customers as well. So it's a win-win. But not everyone has the kind of money to throw at a project like that. But it should be that you have a conversation with your customers who are not able to do this or unwilling to do this or whatever it is. And you say, look, we've had this relationship for X years, but now I'm coming under pressure. It's costing me money that you're not supplying me this data. You got to start thinking about it, and we'll have another conversation in 6 months and you tell me where you are in this journey, or words to that effect. And you got to start planting seeds in people. Often, for the larger companies anyway, this won't be an issue because if you're looking at the 80-20, a lot of those 80 are already on this journey themselves. And so if you have that kind of conversation, very often the answer will be, yeah, actually, we're now working on it as well, and we should be able to report in X months' time or whatever it is. Here's our timeline for it. So a lot of organizations, particularly the larger ones, have woken up to this or are on that journey somewhere.
Yes, this is one of the areas where theory and reality often clash. Because, as you said, companies may have ambitious reporting goals, but then they run into supplier data gaps, inconsistent methodologies, missing product level information, and so on and so forth. But when they work together with suppliers, I think it's the key to success.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can't do it without the support of your suppliers. And in fact, longer term, it will mean for closer relationships with them, which can only be good for everyone.
Exactly. And probably they will be able to sign contracts for a longer period of time. Plus, when you have already a supplier who gives you reliable data, you maintain this relationship. It's more difficult for a third party, a supplier B, to enter this relationship and disrupt their business dealings.
Correct.
100%.
And as I said, similar to the customers of that leisure resort, if they are now providing that data to you, they can also provide it to all their other customers. So it's a win for them too.
And information is one of the most expensive commodities nowadays, if not the most. You have
Yeah.
spent a lot of time discussing digital transformation in sustainability and supply chains. Where do you think the technology actually help, and where do companies tend to overestimate what technology can solve?
Yeah, good question. Well, obviously, the technology can help a lot in accessing that data and distributing that data, the data we talked about already. It will help when you start visualizing that data, you will start to see a lot of inefficiencies. So it'll help get rid of those, bring your costs down. Where is it overestimated? Good question. Struggling to come up with an answer to that.
Maybe it's not overestimated,
I'm sure it is somewhere.
but people
Um,
tend to overestimate everything because I'm pretty sure that we'll be able to find some examples.
exactly. But where it is massively useful is, as we've said throughout this episode, it's accessing the data that organizations need, either for themselves or from their suppliers, so that their suppliers can give them the data they need. It's, that technology is foundational, fundamental, absolutely fundamental for getting the access to the data you need.
I would say currently, where is the overestimation? Maybe with the help of AI in some of the tools, because as we know, we are at this early stage. And when we talk to companies, there are many tools that promise, let's say, better visibility, automated reporting, AI powered insights, or even full supply chain transparency. But technology usually works only if the processes, incentives that we've discussed earlier, even from the government, and data foundations are already in place. So at
That's
first, I would
fair.
say the most important, as you said yourself, the data is the key. Technology comes afterwards because without reliable data, it's very easy to overestimate all the results, given most powerful AI tools, right?
Yeah, no, that's fair. There's a lot of AI washing going on, a lot of AI hype going on. Uh,
Greenwashing, yeah,
yeah,
true.
so there's a lot of hype around AI, and in some cases with good reason, because it is delivering a lot. But a lot of it is down to how that AI is implemented. So if it's implemented well, we've already said we're looking at, getting access to data, and AI is useless without data. But you give AI access to data, implement it properly, it should be able to pull out insights that it would take humans a long time to figure out if they ever did. And this is across the board. I mean, we're seeing in the health sector, we're seeing AI finding links between things that had never been found before. We're seeing it being able to look at MRI scans, for example, and find suspicious lumps that could turn into, cancer years before a radiologist would have found them, things like that. There's all these kind of things, linkages between different viruses. So what it can do, properly implemented, is hugely impressive. But that properly implemented part is extremely important as well, because there have been a lot of AI projects which went nowhere after people spending lots of money on them because they weren't thought through properly, or it was implemented poorly. So it's one that you need to be careful of. We've had AI for a long time, but this new generative AI, it's only been around since 2022 at any scale. And so it's still quite young, it's still quite immature, so you need to approach that with a certain amount of caution.
And as we know, AI is now being discussed in almost every business function, including procurement, energy management, logistics, reporting, medicine, as you mentioned, but let's focus on our sustainability field and also emissions tracking. So, if you could tell us what are the most realistic use cases for AI in sustainability and supply chain transformation today, that would be great.
I think probably if I had to pick one, I would go with procurement because particularly for the larger organizations who have thousands, tens of thousands of suppliers, it's very straightforward today to look out through your suppliers and go, okay, we can sort them by price, we can sort them by on-time delivery, we can sort them by whatever kind of uh, factors you look at, but you still can't easily sort them by emissions. And even if you can, you got to do a kind of multivariate analysis because you want your suppliers to be low emissions, on-time delivery, low cost, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, for procurement professionals, access to this data and doing multivariate analysis across tens of thousands of suppliers is not something they're going to be able to do without AI. But with access to AI, you should be able to use AI to massively get your emissions down just by optimizing your procurement processes so that your scope 3 emissions come way, way down because you're choosing more sustainable suppliers.
This is a very practical insight. Thank you very much for that. Because AI can clearly be very useful, but it can also become another buzzword if people do not define the actual business problem that they are trying to solve. This is exactly what you've said earlier. And what role do large enterprise platforms and system play in sustainability transformation? Do you think they are becoming more important as reporting on operation requirements become more complex? I wanted to ask this question because I think it disconnects very well with your SAP background.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, again, this is an it depends answer. But for the larger organizations, yeah, you need to have a digital backbone. And obviously, it's going to be some form of an ERP system, which allows you to embed your carbon emissions into your financial transactions. So you need to know for every single process and transaction that you're doing, what are the costs associated with this and what are the emissions associated with this. So that's nigh on impossible to do without a decent ERP system in place. Now, for smaller companies, you're not going to need to roll out a 5 or 10 million euro SAP or Oracle system or whatever it is. But for the larger companies who already have these in place or they're not large companies, the access to this kind of information will help them enormously, to my earlier point, get their emissions down by allowing them to identify through their suppliers who their high emission suppliers are. And to the earlier points as well, then working with those suppliers to say, oi, we have an issue that we need to work on. So this is something I've been harping on about for a long, long time, is procurement. Because, I mean, we all know your scope 3 emissions are, depending again on the industry you're in, 70, 80, 90, in excess of 90% of your emissions. And so, sure, you can get a renewable energy provider, and sure, you can get the plastic cups out of your canteen, and sure, you can go on all these wonderful projects to reduce your scope 1 and 2 emissions. But if that's only 10, 15, 20% of your emissions, the other 80, 90% coming from your suppliers through your procurement organization, that's where you can have a huge, huge impact, going through that and getting those numbers down.
Got it. So actually, sustainability should, if I understood correctly, shouldn't be treated as a separate layer. It should be embedded into core business systems, right? And treated as
Absolutely.
a whole.
Yeah. Yeah. The same way finance is. Exactly the same. Emissions should be viewed as a cost in exactly the same way euros are. They should be accounted for using the same systems in the exact same way, and they should be reported with the same rigor. And that will come, that requirement will come. You'll start to see the sustainability organization be folded into the CFO's organization. It'll become part of finance because the rigor required for the reporting will start to mean that it has to be reported with the same rigor as the financial reports are reported today.
And when you speak with executives, what do you think they still misunderstand? Maybe they understand everything about the energy transition and climate related business transformation. I want to ask this question because executives, at least those that we are talking to, are often under pressure from different directions. They have to manage costs, regulations, customers, investors, and operational realities. So it would be helpful to understand what they usually get right and where the blind spots still are.
Sure. And that's, again, it
Depends.
depends. Yeah, sorry to do this to you, but it's an it depends because it depends on who you're talking to. It depends on the industry they're in. It depends on the exposure they've had. It depends on et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But very often in these conversations, a lot of executives are unaware that renewables are cheaper. They're unaware how much it costs to roll out a renewable park beside their plant. They might be unaware that PPAs exist and that they can roll out this solar park through a PPA provider at no capex. So, and this would give them secure energy for 20, 30 years, security of cost and security of supply. They're unaware that, again, to the points we made earlier, EVs are cheaper to operate, far cheaper to operate in terms of fueling and in terms of maintenance. There are upfront costs, obviously, which are coming down as well. There was a report from Motor Trend in the UK 3-4 weeks ago, which said now the average cost of an EV is cheaper than the same model if it's petrol or diesel. So they're starting to cross over. And that's not in every market yet, but that will come because the cost price of internal combustion engine vehicles is flat to increasing. The cost curve of EVs is down, 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 down. And again, that's what we talked about earlier, learning curve across batteries particularly. What else? A lot of it as well, the upcoming regulations around reporting, the requirements of the banks and the insurance industry that we talked about are something that a lot of executives are still unaware of. The fact that, and that's because they're new, this financed and insured emissions is a new field because the insurance companies and the finance companies and the banks have only been required to report these more recently. And this reporting is only going to become more rigorous. So you'll get enabled emissions coming along as a thing soon. So enabled emissions, if you're not familiar with the term, enabled emissions are where you are helping a company to increase its emissions. So, for example, if you're a cloud provider and you're selling your cloud solution to a fossil fuel company, and it helps the fossil fuel company more efficiently extract oil and gas from the ground, then you are an enabler of those emissions. So your enabled emissions have to be counted on your balance book. So suddenly you are responsible for those emissions. The same way the banks and the insurance companies are responsible for the emissions associated with your loans and your insurance. you're responsible for the emissions of your cloud solution if it's being used by fossil fuel companies. That hasn't been regulated yet, but that's the next thing to come along, I suspect, because financed and insured emissions weren't regulated until quite recently. That's the next one on the list. So
That would be a very fair approach,
yeah,
100%.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So going back to your first point, I think the biggest general misconception is that sustainable products, sustainable services are always more expensive. Honestly, personally, I also need to still switch my mind sometimes because I've got this misconception probably instilled many years ago that sustainability is always more expensive, which is not always the case. And as we talked at the very beginning, most probably in the future, the costs will diminish. It will decrease as well.
Correct. Yeah, no, 100%. And it's around Wright's law, it's around the learning curve, and it's around economies of scale as these things happen. Just fundamentally, as I said, the renewable energy is cheaper. The efficiencies that you're getting with sustainability means you're producing more for fewer inputs, so your costs are coming down. Your cost of insurance and capital are coming down. Your cost of acquisitions of customers and employees are coming down. So, yeah, sustainable products, if they're not now cheaper, they will be.
Perfect. And now maybe some practical take for our audience. If you could tell us for companies that want to make real progress but do not have unlimited budgets or large sustainability teams, medium, small enterprises, what should they prioritize first? This is probably one of the most practical questions for our audience because not every company can build a large internal ESG department or buy every new technology platform. Many need just a clear starting point and then a realistic order of priorities.
Yeah, that's always a tough question, isn't it?
Yes.
I would
I always leave the toughest questions until the end.
There are several carbon accounting providers who specialize in small to medium businesses. And so I would seek out one of those and use those to start getting a handle on your emissions so that you can account for them and report them to your customers. Because if they're not already asking you for that, they will soon. So I would say that's the first most immediate step. If you don't already have a carbon accounting solution in place, get one. As I say, there are providers out there who do specialize in small and medium businesses. So your costs aren't going to be high to do it. There are solutions out there for you. It will benefit you in all the ways we talked about it so far in this podcast. It's a no-brainer.
I can only encourage people who are listening, go to netzerocompare.com and over there you can compare different solutions for your company. We have the filter. You can filter for small, medium or large enterprises. So maybe that will be the first step. And before we wrap up, is there anything important we haven't touched on that you think businesses, business leaders, sustainability teams or supply chain professionals should be paying closer attention to right now?
I think the thing that people need to look out for mostly right now is the coming legislation in Europe. There's a lot coming down the line and a lot has been rolled out in the last couple of years. That's the main thing to watch out for, because if you're unaware of what's happening there, you might get a fright when suddenly you're hit with an audit, or your customers are saying to you, "Oi, we're in breach because of you," or similar. So keep an eye out for the legislation that's come into place recently or coming down the line. That'll be the first thing. And other than that, keep listening to this podcast, I guess.
Thank you so much. Tom, thank you again for joining me today on the Net Zero Compare podcast. I really appreciate your time and your perspective.
Not at all. Thanks for having me on, Carl, and thanks to everyone who's listening. If you've stayed with us this far, well done, and thanks for your interest and attention.
Yes, and for everyone listening or watching, we will publish the full conversation on netzerocompare.com. The recording will be also available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. I also encourage listeners to visit Net Zero Compare for practical insights on sustainability, emissions, ESG, climate technology, and regulatory developments. You can also subscribe for free to our newsletter to stay updated on new interviews, articles, and resources.